Is religion inherently violent? Is secularism inherently peaceful? Is the separation of church and state a good thing? Welcome back to Conservative Conversations. I'm Tom Sarrouf, and I'm joined today by Thomas Albert Howard, or as he's known by friends and colleagues, and here at ISI, Tao Howard, who's a professor of humanities and history at Valparaiso University, as well as the author of the recently released Broken Altars, Secularist Violence in Modern History. He's an expert on all of these questions, and we'll be diving in great detail and using his historical mind. So Tao, welcome to Conservative Conversations. Thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me.
I'd be curious to hear a bit more about how you came to this topic and what led you to writing about it and what your kind of core contention is for the book.
Sure, yeah. Well, after 9/11, there has just been a tremendous amount written on the topic of religious violence. And understandably, certainly religious passions played a role in that event. But as I saw journalists and scholars using the term, I wonder sometimes if that term obscures more than it reveals, because often religious conflicts have ethnic, language, all kinds of other things. But being a historian of the modern period too, commentators on religious violence assume that some form of secularism is the cure for religious violence. But being a historian of the modern period, I know that really one of the big narratives is the type of anti-religious violence done by secularist regimes in the 20th century, particularly Marxist, Leninist, and Maoist ones, but other forms of secularism as well. And I thought that story needed to be told.
Is there a distinction between different type of secular regimes? Because, you could think of America as a secular regime, but that's quite different than, say, as you pointed out, like Maoist China or the Soviet Union.
I appreciate that question, because the book operates with a typology of three main types of secularism that have arisen in the Western world after the Enlightenment, after the American and French Revolution, but have since gone global in a globalized era in the late 19th and the 20th century. The American kind is what I call passive secularism. This is the kind we associate with John Locke and James Madison and religious freedom of conscience. So I think some core convictions, conservative convictions that I have. And maybe sometimes people in the West assume that's the only form of secularism. But another type of secularism I call combative secularism. And this descends from the radical phase of the French Revolution in the mid-1790s, when there was extensive de-Christianization and taking over of church properties, guillotining bishops and clergy, making them swear an oath of allegiance to the state. And this type of extreme secularism you see, kind of incubated in France, but carried out by many sort of far-left Republican regimes in the 20th century, like Spain and Mexico, and even imported to Turkey during the Turkish Revolution and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And then finally, the third one is elimination of secularism. And this is particularly associated with Karl Marx, who famously called religion as the opium of the masses, and other radical intellectuals, socialist intellectuals in the late 19th and 20th century. And certainly that tradition is carried on, great violence by Lenin and Stalin in the 20th century. So those are the three types of secularism that I identify in the book.
A counter argument to this the thrust of the argument you're putting forth here in the book is that we could say or understand that for religious violence, the religious belief or the fanatical devotion to it is the driver of these sorts of acts. But with secularism, it wouldn't make sense to attribute the belief or dogma of secularism to the actions, but there's something else motivating the violence, because secularism may be like a form of political atheism. It's not an actual belief system with content, but rather a lack thereof. So how could we then tell whether or not secularism is the driver of violence, as opposed to, in the case of Mao, maybe, or Marx, maybe the envy for the rich, or this sort of sense of justice and injustice, of oppressor and oppressed, which is maybe a belief system that's not tied necessarily to secularism as such. Does that question make sense?
That makes sense. And some of the different countries that I profile, the different forms of secularism play different roles. So it's not sort of a one-size cookie-cutter-fits-all regimes. Since you mentioned Mao, I'll just use that for an example. Mao Zedong famously, told the Dalai Lama that religion is poison when he visited him in the 1950s. But when the Chinese invaded Tibet and late 1950s, and the Dalai Lama had to flee, there is a sense that there's more authoritarian political, realpolitik things going on at the same time. But secularism sort of lends credence to a sort of an inevitability. This is the way that history is going. It's sort of a sophisticated sounding ideology, that helped justify not just in Tibet, but also in the Cultural Revolution throughout China. Was one of the ideological factors that contributed to that. It sort of provides a narrative of progress and helps legitimize violence against religious communities. But maybe an important thing I would say that exists in many of the countries that I profile, that it's often in religious communities that incubate political dissent, that have higher loyalties than just the state. And then they become, certainly like the Orthodox Church in Russia, that Lenin and his comrades found out that they were not easily going along with the Bolshevik Revolution, that the hearts and minds of people were still quite attached to the church. And so it's the secularism, but also the worrying that it's a sort of an incubator of a political dissent is a problem. You see that across Eastern Europe as well.
Is there an inevitable clash between religion and a modern secular state, or are there ways where a secular society could flourish alongside religion?
Well, I think, to go back to the passive model, I think and not just the American case, but, some other Western countries as well, even in the French Revolution, before it became violent and radical in the 1790s, there was more of a live and let live mentality there. And it's, often the distinction is made between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, that the American Revolution was freedom of religion, where the French Revolution was freedom from religion. I think in the American context, it just helps that there was never an established church at the national level, that many of the revolutionaries just, connected throne and altar in France, and that was never the case here. So I think in some ways, just the political culture of the Constitution and the fact that there was no national, certainly there were in states, but there wasn't a national church, contributed to a more workable form of secularism.
One of the strands or ideas or things that I've heard amongst some scholars of Christian political history, Western political history, especially some Straussians, is that one of the geniuses of the American founding is the separation of church and state, because it solves the problem posed by the early modern Reformation era wars of religion, namely by sort of separating or severing the political obligations and citizenship with religious belief that had racked Europe. And America solves this problem, and therefore solves what Strauss and others call the political theological problem. I think you call it the religio-political problem or dilemma in your book. And so I wonder if this line of argument has at its core, it shares the assumption with the secularists that religion is bad or leads to fanaticism inevitably, which I think is part of what you're trying to push back on here, or if this argument lends itself to a healthy secularism, or this passive form that you're talking about.
Yeah. Now, that's a good question. And, my training is in European history, so I'll defer to American historians of the colonial period and the time of the Constitution. But at least from the way I read it, there's some that, like Thomas Jefferson or Paine, that veer a little more in what I would call the combative secularist, that were sort of sympathetic to the French Revolution. And then there were others like Witherspoon or Madison that, a healthier form of passive secularism, I would say, that really tries to give not just people freedom of worship in a very limited sense, but recognizes that both, while there is separation in some sense, that religion, as Alexis de Tocqueville especially pointed out, plays still a very robust role in American life in sort of helping in various social goods and nourishing voluntary communities apart from the state. Like a real example, I teach here at Valparaiso University, which is a Lutheran school. Europe has nothing like just the different types of, Catholic, Lutheran, Reform schools that the United States have. But the separation kind of created this voluntary energy that I think has been, healthy for both church and state. But, certainly there's some extreme secularists that would want to move it in the combative direction. Well,
Yeah, right. I think of Aaron Renn and his thesis that we're now living in the negative world, a world where it's no longer a positive to be seen as a Christian or a believer or a religious person. I think religious minorities, at least in America, insofar as Christianity as historically, and I think still, at least nominally, the majority religion. So religious minorities get off the hook from that, at least by, from some commentators. Others are maybe more across the board, equal opportunity anti-theists. But I'd be curious, actually, to talk about this idea of the religious minority or non-Western religions in particular, and how the role, if we at ISI, we like to focus on and study the best of Western civilization and try to understand how our civilization has answered and tries to answer the questions of how to live and how to live well. But to move outside of Western civilization, insofar as there's a cohesive understanding of that, what might we learn from how other civilizations mix politics and religion and understand both of those things, and then how violence, which is a universal and somewhat common human occurrence, plays into those schema in non-Western civilizations.
There are a number of places I could profile. What if we start with Turkey, though? The First World War brought to an end the Ottoman Empire, and from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, modern Turkey arose, especially under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, who became known as Atatürk, the father of the Turks. And most, I think, what we could learn is probably negative. I mean, he really took the combative secularism from the French revolutionary tradition, which in French they call laïcité, secularism, and tried to impose it in a very draconian, top-down way in the 1920s, eliminating some of the historical offices of the Sultan and the Caliphate, and forcing people to dress in Western ways, rendering illegal wearing certain Muslim headgear, and was a very statist, top-down enforcement of kind of the French revolutionary tradition. And so that, I argue that there are aspects of violence in that, which there certainly are, in what becomes Kemalism. But, where often, Muslim extremism is attributed just to a kind of fanaticism and religious, it's sort of in opposition to a secularist extremism and statism that is experienced by many Muslims, that I think has contributed to some of the violence, in the modern world today. Like one of the, early Islamist groups, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, arose in the 1920s, directly connecting its foundation to the extreme statist, top-down secularism that Atatürk brought. And I think that's, there's been this continual conflict in the 20th century between extreme secularist elements in or Kemalism, fairly pious Turkish population, just to profile one, non-Christian, non-Western area.
That makes sense. And then I think the natural follow-up to me is if there is this more extreme reaction to maybe we'd call it an authoritarian secular imposition, how common of a pattern is that across not just the Western and now, like what across the world, where we see secularist regimes pop up and try to combatively, or as you put, or the other form, the more extreme eliminationist secularism. What's the track record of success and failure in terms of either being successfully suppressing religion, or maybe we call it a failure of the goal to, whereas you get this sort of religious backlash that radiates in various levels of, maybe we'd call it extremism.
And sometimes there's a healthy dimension to the backlash. So certainly I worry about Islamic extremism. It's certainly a negative, but maybe I'll profile two countries in Eastern Europe. Poland has been historically Catholic, but after it became under Soviet influence in World War II, that really kind of quickened a kind of Catholic identity, really brought it to life, and it became a kind of a breeding ground for a healthy political dissent to the Soviet rule. Certainly someone like John Paul II, comes out of this type of reinvigorated Polish Catholicism, and so it has a track record of quite good, and that would be kind of an ironic example of what the Soviet Union hoped to do. Just the opposite had happened, really quicken Catholic identity, and according to many historians, and myself included, the moral voice of John Paul II was a key factor in bringing down the whole Soviet system. But another case would be Little Albania, where there was a dictator, Enver Hoxha, who really tried to sort of out Stalin or out Mao. And in 1967, Albania just rendered religion illegal. Literally, you could not be religious. That was just every church and mosque in the country was either destroyed or converted to some other secular use. Albania is pretty complicated religiously, but with both Muslims and Orthodox and Catholics. And it was so scorched earth that it really just kind of destroyed the religious heritage in the country and religious literacy among young people. I think some of it has bounced back. I had an opportunity to travel to Albania to do research for this project, but that would be one of the extreme cases where sadly it sort of succeeded, and to the point that you could not name children after names in the Bible or the Quran, and other people were just scared to talk about religion of their children. The children might say something at school, and then they would be then questioned by the secret police. So that was a case of sadly that kind of quite successful, if you will. Where Poland, you see a pretty strong backlash.
The literature focuses more predominantly on religious violence. I think you're pointing out here that in this book that the so-called secular historical epoch is littered with violence of its own. But what are these one-to-one comparisons? Are there differences in the mode, in the scope of violence, and the targets? I'm maybe thinking a little bit of Ernst Junger in his essay Total Mobilization talks about how war changes, and that change is predicated on the notion of how progress manifests in society and how that affected World War I. But when you're thinking about violence, or maybe is it, with secular violence, is it more state-sponsored violence, or is it maybe vigilante or extra-legal violence within an egalitarian, neutral, legal structure versus religious violences?
I would say predominantly I'm focused on state-sponsored violence, and that when the seculars have the upper hand, during the French Revolution, during the Jacobin radical phase, after the Bolshevik Revolution, after the Chinese Revolution, after the Kemalist Revolution in Turkey. So I'd say that's the primary case. But I can think of a number of places where it would be, done during wartime situations. Just to profile one case in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union had these three small enclaves of Buddhism that never really warmed up to the Soviet state. And during World War II, Stalin was trying to, manufacture enthusiasm for the fight against Germany. Some of these places just did not cooperate, and sometimes the violence, in the frame of a larger war, can be quite extensive against them. One group of Buddhists in Kalmykia that Stalin just relocated the entire population to Siberia and Central Asia at a time to kind of try to wipe them out as an ethnic people group. Certainly like the Chinese invasion of Tibet, the religious repression, began to happen right after the French Revolution. The Chinese Revolution in 1949. But that comes to Tibet a little later. Of course, China would say Tibet has sort of always been part of China. But I think wartime conditions can aggravate different types of violence, but state-sponsored violence is primarily what I was going after.
It just occurred to me, Tal, that we've been talking about religion and secularism and violence, and I think we've identified, or you've described in great detail, the differences of secularism and what violence means, but we actually haven't put a definition of religion on the table. So, what do we mean by religion exactly?
Religion is it's sort of a woolly mammoth. It's a strange word. Many languages lack this abstraction of religion. And in my own researches of the term, both for this project and in past projects, I've noted, as many scholars have, that for most of Western history, it means something like devotion or piety. It's really only in the Enlightenment, this colonial period, that it becomes this genus thing where there are different species. There's religion, and then there's Buddhism, Hinduism, terms that are actually coined by scholars. So, exactly what it is often hard to pin down. But Marx was, thinking in the 19th century, he was thinking this, more modern understanding of religion, where the assumption is there's one type of religion and someone's a member of that or another religion. But of course, in Asia, there's like plural religious identities. Someone might be Taoist, Confucian, and Buddhist kind of at the same time. So I think the Western Marxist idea of religion is often exporting to other parts of the world and strange effects.
Yeah, because I want to ask about, is this distinction or antithesis between the idea of religion and the idea of the secular, is that tenable, or is that conceptually confused, or is it an untenable distinction ultimately?
Yeah. I think it makes more sense in some ways in the West. Going all the way back to the Bible, there's, the things that are and are not of Caesar, the role of the state, the role of the church. So I think this dichotomy, it wasn't just invented by modern thinkers like John Locke or other Enlightenment thinkers. There have been long notions of differences between church and state in different spheres. But certainly when this idea is, exported out again to Muslim areas or Asian areas, it doesn't necessarily fit, that easily. But some more zealous reformers want to make it fit in various ways and create, this sphere called religion, like in Chinese. I take them do not speak Chinese, but I take this from other scholars, there was really no word for religion until the late 19th century. And then it was sort of imported from the West via Japan. So it's an interesting case of a Western export word that might make more sense, with the structures of, Western civilization in the modern West than it does in other parts of the world.
As a follow-up to that, I'd be curious. I know, there's Eric Voegelin and the idea of a political religion.
Yep.
From within the National Socialist movement, Carl Schmitt, the idea of political theology. Russell Kirk, the American conservative, I think I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but, all political disputes ultimately are religious. But this idea that the secular actually is always religious, that secular actors, their beliefs or their self-understanding could only be motivated by something that's analogous to a religious fervor. Or you can see historical examples where the, purportedly secular regime, in the 20th century, this sort of century of horrors, you have fascism, even though the state is the sort of sacralized thing. You have like the Austrian clerical fascists, or the example of Franco, or I think Perón in Argentina, or even now the Chinese Communist Party, as I understand it, is kind of flirting with a state ideology that brings back in Confucianism, which is maybe not a formal religion the way that, Christianity is, but has like ancestor worship and sort of veneration for tradition and ancestors. So I guess maybe trying to problematize or play devil's advocate that this idea of secular violence is actually secular at all, but really is sort of religious in its own way and just kind of diluted about what it actually is.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I sort of have an ambivalent attitude. While I respect people like Eric Voegelin, or you could trace this back even to the earlier in the 19th century with Alexis de Tocqueville talking about modern political ideologies having almost a religious dimension. And in the book and in my other scholarship and writing, I've drawn from this type of scholarship and think it does have some analytic powers and explanatory power. I would say two things, though, in criticism. One is that, part of a historian's vocation and task was to try to inhabit the mindset of the people in the past and what they thought they were doing, and sort of allow that empathy or an ability to try to identify with actors in the past. And certainly, like in the case of Vladimir Lenin, he did not see himself as founding a new religion. What he felt he was doing was exorcising religion from human history and creating this new, purely immanent, empirical, scientific, new atheist, or new Soviet, person. So that's where I think it might break down a little. On the other end, sometimes critics of, that all religion is always violence, it kind of lets them off the hook if they say, Marxism, Leninism, it really wasn't just a secular ideology, it was actually a religion. And then you can easily say, but religions are always violent. And so this wasn't true secularism. It was just kind of a religious ideology. And we all know religion leads to violence. And so that's just another form of the same thing that the Catholics did and Protestants and, others. And so I think, in the book, I argue that, there is this, what Lenin and many others, reformers, revolutionaries, intellectuals, late 19th and 20th century saw themselves doing was really trying to take humanity away from a religious path to this new positive, this imminent, purely secular future.
So what I'm hearing is then that that sort of way of thinking still seeds the premise that religion leads to violence.
Yeah,
it doesn't actually get us out of the quagmire.
And often some of the thinkers, or I use the term a stadial conception of history often. This kind of goes back to Hegel and Marx. There are these different stages of history: the feudal, the bourgeois, the proletarian, the religious, and the secular. Another figure that influenced a lot of the combative secularist tradition is the sociologist Auguste Comte, who had a huge influence in the 19th century in France and other countries. But he had this view that there were three big stages of human history, from the theological to the philosophical to the positivist or scientist. And even though some of his rhetoric does sound very religious-ish, he, like Marx, like a number of radical Enlightenment traditions, saw themselves as promoting a post-religious future, and I try to take that seriously. And again, while I respect many scholars who understand modern political ideologies as religion or quasi-religions, I choose to dissent from it a little bit.
Towards the tail end of this conversation, I want to ask you a question about Christian nationalism, which we've covered in some on the podcast, but also it's in the news a lot.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could situate this resurgent movement, or claims that there is this resurgent movement known as Christian nationalism. And I wonder how that situates itself from, within the scholarship that you've done in this book, and how you see it in terms of the ideas of secularism versus religion and religious traditionalism as it's been practiced in America, but we've also seen with various parallel cases in Europe.
No, that's true. I mean, this could be a case of the, and I'm a historian. Historians, when we have to speak on the present, we always do a lot of throat clearing, and I'm not a prophet type of thing. But I think for some of the political currents in this country and some of them in Europe, there has sometimes been more assertive secularism, especially at the elite level, in media, in intellectual circles, and the editorials of papers that have sometimes a contemptuous view of religion. And so I think in some ways, talking about the backlash earlier, that sometimes this has an ironic result and produces sort of a religiously resurgent backlash. I think that is something that's going on now. What I would say to those who want to go in that direction, is don't let your enemies define you. Figure out what is a healthy understanding of church and state, where different religions can thrive, contribute to the voluntary network of institutions in the United States, and don't just go after the idol of state power alone, to reassert some form of Christendom, but recognize in this country there are many wonderful Christian influences that can have a certainly leaven effect on political order, but you don't want to make sort of capture of the state your sole goal, I would say. I see there's some real divergences between Europe and the United States in this respect, especially with the long historic tensions between Europe and the Muslim world, and a lot of the immigration in Europe coming from the Muslim world. That's certainly some of that in the United States, but I think there's some different dynamics going on as well.
You've done this scholarship, you've written this book. We recommend that our listeners go out and go get the book and go read it and be edified by it. But I wonder, is there anything, that must be done? We have this narrative that is, I think you and I would both agree, is overwrought, that religion causes violence, secularism is the answer. Is there anything more that would be done, or is a sort of maybe a policy implication or an educational sort of imperative that's needed in order to help recenter our understanding? Or is it just go read the book and be educated and just know better?
You could do worse than read the book. So I would say start. I would say start there. And there are a number of articles and things that I've derived from the book that I have, and other places that you probably could get just by Googling my name and secularism and religion and those type of things. I think I'm a big believer in just religious freedom, the passive freedom that we talked about, and it's I think in a very healthy way it has emerged in the American political realities, but I think it does have salience for other traditions and other communities as well. I think a robust understanding of religious freedom would help some of the Christian minorities in the Muslim world, for example. and other places. And there are a number of organizations that work to bolster and uphold that form of religious freedom. But I as a Christian, I think one's conscience is inviolable, and coercion by the state is never a good thing for religion. So I think that's something that the American founding that we can be quite proud of, and seek to promote. Recognizing too, I think that different civilizations, different cultures have different dynamics in play sometime. But I would like religious freedom, like literacy or something like that, like Arabic numerals or something that can be imported and embraced by humanity.
Well, excellent. On that note, Tal, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me and educate me and our listeners to your new book, which is, again, Broken Altars, Secularist Violence in Modern History. So to our viewers and listeners, we recommend go out, get the book, read it. And Tal, if there's anything else that you would like to listeners to go view or go keep track of what you're up to and what sort of work that you're doing, well, where would you recommend that they look?
Well, let's see. One thing I'm doing, it's not a book yet, but I've been working for quite a while on a general intellectual history of Christian theology in the modern period, and I hope that would be out within a couple of years. During a few years ago, some of your readers or some of your listeners, might be interested in some work I did on the time of the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation in 1517, and also maybe some of your Catholic listeners would enjoy a book I wrote called "The Pope and the Professor," interesting episode in Catholic history of the 19th century.
I appreciate you coming on very much, and congratulations again on the book. It's called Broken Altars, Secularist Violence in Modern History. So to our viewers and listeners, go get the book and read it and be edified by it. But Tal, thanks again so much.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thanks again for listening to Conservative Conversations. I'm Tom Sarrouf. If you liked this episode, like, subscribe so you don't miss another episode, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.